Hello，大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度关注在中国的这一场危机中，李强崛起了，并走向前台。曾经的店小二在老板的放权之下，要操持当家。中国国务院总理李强将前往印度尼西亚首都雅加达出席中国东盟领导人会议。根据中国外交部，李强将于9月5日至8日出席在印尼雅加达举行的第26次中国东盟10+1领导人会议、第26次东盟与中日韩10+3领导人会议和第18届东亚峰会。并对印尼正式进行一个国事访问。结合早前一天路透社援引熟悉情况的印度和中国的消息来源报道说，中国国家主席习近平可能不出席9月9日至10日在印度新德里举行的 G20 峰会。或许李强也会顺路去一趟印度，代表习近平参加 G20 峰会。一位中国时政观察人士向华尔街电视频道透露，这一次李强将出席东亚合作领导人系列会议，代表着李强进一步走向国际舞台。在2023年的上半年，李强是展开了上任中国国务院总理后的首度拜访，先后抵达欧盟主要经济体德国和法国。当时的访问是继2022年底和2023年年初德法元首访华之后，中方领导人受邀回访。而这一次根据这位中国时政观察人士，李强已经确定去东亚合作领导人系列会议。如果他再去 G20 峰会，那就意味着李强开始承担更多权力，不仅处理中国国内事务，也开始在国际上代表中国1号人物习近平。稍早在8月下旬，南华早报有一篇独家报道提到，中国国家主席习近平取得了第3任期后减少公开露面，似乎更放心授权亲信下达重大决定，转居幕后运筹帷幄。这篇文章认为，尽管中国政治一向令人雾里看花，但各项会议依旧是习近平宣达指示的主要平台，亦能借此反映在不同领域的深度和力度。就公开资讯所示，自中共2022年10月20日的10月份的20大落幕至上周年度的北戴河会议期间，习近平主持会议的次数明显少于前2次任期的同一时间。虽然一般认为此事与疫情有关，但中国今年3月召开全国两会之后，当即宣布全面解封。之后，习近平仅主持19次国内要务会议，相较5年前和10年前同期均有所减少。这篇文章还观察到，习近平频频授权亲信出席过去不假他人的国内会议，包括由中共中央政治局常委兼中央军委会副主席何卫东出席7月全军党的建设会议，钦点国务院总理李强主持博鳌论坛。此外，国际会议场合也较少见到习近平的现身。尽管露面次数减少，而习近平一手提拔的亲信与官媒仍称，几乎所有重大的政策均由习近平部署，包括促进经济成长与近期的水患纾困措施等等。美国芝加哥大学的政治学系教授杨大力就说，先前任期时，习近平是急于借由会议表达观点，如今则偏向退居幕后操控。推估因为权势稳固后更收放自如。柏林智库莫卡托中国研究所的首席分析师何青山就说，习近平现在有一批一手提拔的新副代表出席会议，让他不必紧抓着不放，得以在幕后掌控全局，拥有比以往更充裕的时间。上文提到的中国时政观察人士，他对华尔街频道介绍，一部分人认为李强过去升得太快，习近平又那么强势，李强即便上位总理，也可能只是跟班的，不会走向前台。结果现在看来是习近平放权了，现在是李强更多主持会议、出席活动、接见要员，习近平反而不怎么参加。李强是习近平最重要的心腹之一，李强经常提到一个词叫店小二。早在浙江担任省长期间，李强就曾表态政府要为创客们当好店小二。后来浙江义乌为服务企业专门成立了店小二办，一路传为佳话。而到了江苏李强也多次重提所谓的店小二的精神，表示要围绕企业需求提供精准化、具体化服务，营造公平透明的发展环境。 后来到了上海，李强也提到过说对上海各级政府和官员来说，习惯店小二式的低姿态，恰恰是为了引领发展的高站位。上文提到的中国时政观察人士，他对华尔街电视的频道介绍，李强这位店小二得到了店老大的器重。很多店老大呢，之前其实也是店小二们慢慢做出来的。和之前一样，习近平和之前不一样的是，习近平之前是搭档的李克强，而习近平李克强的关系更像是一对合伙人。那个人呢有个人的想法，他们所代表的政治势力也不一样。习近平也不可能把李克强当自己人来看待。在过去10年，中共中央和国务院的关系也一直没理顺。现在李强带着店小二的姿态上位总理，他和李克强完全不同。当年习近平和李强同在浙江时，李强就是习近平的大管家。为了服侍店老大，李强甚至是家也不回，就在办公室睡。靠着这样的态度，李强赢得了习近平的信任。即便在2022年上半年上海封城期间，居民被关在家中或条件恶劣的隔离中心里，难以获取到食物，和身着白色防护服的警察对抗。当时还有一段李强视察被封小区遭到阿姨痛骂的场面，我们也给大家一起来回顾一下。
不要瞪那个谁啊！
来解决疫情的讲房产证，这个房产证为主导，先以疫情为主，你怎么为老百姓服务，对不对？好不容易看到你们来了，我们现在现实情况要反映上去，对不对？另外呢，越来的菜价全都给贪污了，大家捞不着吃，对不对？现在有这种情况啊，哎是啊。
上面这个视频的背景是上海市政府官方微博上海发布提到，李强在2022年4月11日曾前往部分居民区检查基本物资供应保障和封闭小区的管理状况，探望慰问在第一线防疫的基层干部、医务及居民职工，向支持防疫防控的群众表示感谢。那当时在网络上有多个微博网民爆料说，李强先是视察了浦西一个事先规划的小区，随后李强出乎意料的带领随行的上海官员转往不远的另一个不在行程规划中的小区视察。但根据在现场的网民拍下的画面，李强等人在这个小区外隔着栏杆与一名坐着轮椅的白发老妇与另外2名妇女阿姨交谈，而轮椅老妇情绪激动，当着李强的面大声指责是物资缺乏。一旁的2位阿姨及闻风赶到的其他住户也有抱怨上海封城期间的种种问题。那在当时不少人看来，这可能会毁掉李强的政治生涯，但最终在20大最后，李强是以中国第2高官的位置出现在了人民大会堂，地位仅次于习近平。上文提到的中国时政观察人士，他对华尔街电视频道介绍，很多人看到李强被骂，认为这是李强没有管理好上海的政局，但恰恰这也是这段视频作为上海封城2个多月的插曲之一，体现出李强有李强自己的勇敢。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容，更多资讯可以关注6度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
Earlier this month, President Biden met with the leaders of Japan and South Korea to unveil a new trilateral alliance linking the countries together to counter rising threats from North Korea and China. The White House hopes the partnership alters the strategic landscape against Beijing. And earlier today, I sat down with a U.S. diplomat who has a front row seat to how the tides are changing in the region. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel. Ambassador Emanuel, welcome to What's News. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
This region potentially doesn't have a lot of time before some relatively scary scenarios could emerge on the security front. Xi Jinping has told his military to be ready for an invasion of Taiwan potentially by 2027. Is that a date that occupies space in your mind?
I mean, you're cognizant of it without it becoming myopic about it. And I also think the most important thing to do is our level of deterrence. And when I say ours, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all of those countries who share a basic set of principles and ideals together and are willing to sacrifice for them. Like what happened the other day at Camp David with Korea, Japan, and the United States is part of that deterrence. What happened, 18 months earlier with the announcement of AUKUS is part of that. Taiwan is one issue, but I think before you even think about Taiwan, I would think about what's happening in the South China Sea and what's happening with the Philippines. There's a number of things given China's behavior. In the last 6 months, China has had 2 land conflicts with India, many kind of conflicts with the Philippines. You've had constant incursion on Taiwan air and water space. You've had multiple incursions into Japanese air and water space. You've had tracking of the United States planes, also Australia and Canada. So you could pick which country you think is the trigger. And that's what's actually the most prevalent fact in the Indo-Pacific, is that China is, whether it's on military terms, political terms, or on strategic terms and economic terms, is not a good neighbor.
You mentioned willingness to sacrifice for shared endeavors.
Yeah.
If we do get to that worst case scenario, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, will Japan fight alongside the U.S.?
That's a question for the Japanese, not for the U.S. ambassador. But I do think what's significant is, before there was a tank on the Ukrainian border by Russia, Prime Minister Kishida called for dramatically increasing and doubling Japan's defense budget to go from the 9th largest in the world to the 3rd, and to acquire certain skills and capabilities that they never thought of. That was before the world, quote unquote, changed. Japan is also getting capabilities that are very relevant to its security and to being a full partner in making sure that the Indo-Pacific remains free and open. They have put deterrence and put a capital D behind it, and it's welcomed by the United States. I really think you got to look back at what happened at Camp David. We have, the United States, a complicated history with Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea have a complicated history with Japan and Korea. Korea and Japan have a complicated history with the United States. And what happened at Camp David, when you look at it in contrast to what's going on in Ukraine, President Biden, President Yoon, and Prime Minister Kishida decided to make something of the 21st century peacefully. I think that's a pretty broad, big statement.
And you think that's a future-proof alliance that's being built now?
I do think the strategic plates shifted on August 19th, and I know that because of the way China's rhetoric at containment got hot. I also think it's an example, as I said earlier, about putting the past and seizing the future. That's what leadership's about. It has the potential, if we do as much hard work today in putting the roots down of those principles that were on the communique on the page, then we're going to have an alliance among 3 countries that will stand the test of time.
Economic ties between the U.S. and China are slipping now. You have been outspoken in your criticism of the Communist Party at a time when, cabinet officials have been trying to put a floor under relations.
I'm for that. I'm for not only a floor, I'm for a dialogue. But I'm also not for being, as my father would say, a schmuck. And he said it with this term of endearment. I mean, what I mean by this is, Xi stood in the Rose Garden and said, we will never militarize the South China Sea. The wheels of his plane were not up in the belly of the plane when they were doing exactly that. They're part of the World Trade Organization, international economic structure. I can't tell you how many times I had a CEO in my office when I was chief of staff, when I was a congressman, and would say that they're stealing intellectual property, they're stealing product, they're making us give it to them for free so they could basically underwrite and then also undermine your product and do nothing but replicate it. Not even a bolt or a screw was different. So at some point, you got to say, look, now you can sit there and say, well, we'd like to have a great relationship, but if they're going to keep the Communist Party, and specifically under Xi, use lying and cheating as a modus operandi of the state and its legitimacy, then you would be a fool to go into that discussion negotiation not cognizant of what they're doing. And my view is, keep doing what you're doing. You're the one with 30% unemployment among youth, not us. You got 10 years of housing with nobody in it. You got people that are getting fleeced by the big developers and the banks. You got municipalities in China that make Chicago look like a AAA rated bond. Keep at it. There is nothing the United States is doing to you that measures what you've done to yourself. We didn't do any of that. And so my point is, I'm ready to have a conversation. I'm also ready not to get in the way of you doing to yourself what we could never only hope on our best day could get done to you. And if you want to stay doing it, and you want to walk away from the international system that you benefited from, well, there, for the grace of God, go ahead. Why should I get in the way of that?
Ambassador Emanuel, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
For a quick debrief on what we've just heard there, I'm joined by Journal Tokyo Bureau Chief Peter Landers. Peter, you sat in on this interview earlier today. What jumped out to you?
I was surprised at how forcefully the ambassador took on China and personally accused Chinese leader Xi Jinping of mismanaging the economy, took issue with his positions on South China Sea and intellectual property. And certainly China would take issue with what the ambassador said. China would say that its construction activities in the South China Sea, including military facilities, those are legitimate within its sovereign rights of self-defense. And in fact, China says it's the U.S. that is responsible for militarizing the area by sending warships and military aircraft into what China would say is its territorial waters and airspace. And we also heard Ambassador Emanuel talk about stealing intellectual property, as he alleged, but China says that's not the case, that they are working to improve legal protections for intellectual property rights and defend the international intellectual property system. So they would say their economic growth is part of their own efforts and reject what the ambassador is saying, that Xi Jinping is responsible for China's problems.
And Peter, on the ambassador's remarks about the youth unemployment situation in China, you almost got the sense that he was seeing what was happening there as being somewhat beneficial to the U.S. in terms of proving a point. Was that notable to you, given that, for instance, today, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was wrapping up her visit to China and had said earlier in the week that it would be in the interests of both the U.S. and China, and she said to the world, really, for these countries to have a stable economic relationship given their $700 billion in trade. What do you make of that?
It did seem as if he saw some benefit for the United States in China having economic problems, and he even exaggerated how bad the youth unemployment situation is in China. He said the rate is 30%. The most recent figure we have is actually 21%, although China stopped reporting it in July, so it could have risen since then. But just in that exaggeration and the general tone of his remarks, he did seem to be suggesting that it was not a problem at all for the United States if China is in trouble. And that's different from what we would hear from Secretary Raimondo in Beijing, where she is pointing to the benefits for the world of more trade between China and the U.S.
在12年前，福岛核电站因地震而发生熔毁，反应堆的冷却系统受损。东京电力公司 TEPCO 开始向设施注入海水，以防止反应堆过热。这些受到放射性物质污染的海水被储存于厂址附近的储罐中，其中部分已存储长达12年之久。日本的解决方案是对这些水进行处理、稀释，然后释放到海洋中。这种逐步释放经过处理的受污染水的过程将持续30年。这一方案已获得多个无关国际组织的批准，包括国际原子能机构 IAEA 以及联合国的核监督机构。科学家们也同意进行废水释放。驻福岛的国际原子能机构 IAEA 表示，经过独立的现场分析显示，排放水中的氚浓度远低于每升1500贝克勒尔每升的运营限值。这个限值比世界卫生组织对饮用水的限值低6倍，后者为每升10000贝克勒尔每升。根据国际原子能机构的积极监测，目前排放废水中的辐射水平为每升205贝克勒尔 BQL。虽然和专家似乎普遍认为，将经过处理的废水逐步释放到海洋中不会对人类或海洋生物产生长期影响， 围绕废水释放的科学共识的问题之一在于，随着科学的进步，科学领域的专业化也在不断增强。虽然和科学家一致认为辐射水平应该尽量降低，但美国国家海洋实验室协会呼吁加强对海洋生物影响的研究。在日本、韩国和斐济，抗议者仍然反对将废水释放到海洋中。马绍尔群岛和塔希提岛的政府也感到担忧。中国还宣布将暂停从日本进口水产品。绿色和平组织发布了一项研究，指出放射性同位素的长期环境影响尚不清楚且研究不足。重要的是要承认人们强烈反对释放经过处理的废水的原因。在日本，广泛存在着对广岛和长崎核爆事件的文化创伤。有关核爆幸存者及其子女健康障碍的普遍焦虑至今仍然存在。这种文化创伤在许多太平洋岛屿上也存在，这些岛屿靠近美国的核试验场地。日本国内对政府和安全政策的怀疑部分是由于许多广岛核爆幸存者未接受治疗，反而被美国和日本的研究人员用作研究辐射中毒和暴露影响的试验对象。福岛核事故是一个明证，表明日本政府未能履行其在核电站确保适当安全措施方面的职责，这削弱了公众对政府的信任。不仅普遍如此，而且特别是在核项目和清理方面确保公民安全的能力上。原子科学家公报引用了一份报告，称福岛核电站事故是政府、监管机构和东京电力公司之间的勾结结果，他们实际上背叛了国家免受核事故威胁的权利。东京电力公司 TEPCO 在核电站废水储存方面也发生了几起事故，导致废水泄漏。2013年8月 TEPCO 披露有300公吨高度放射性废水从储罐中泄漏出来。2013年10月 TEPCO 披露另一个储罐正在泄漏，一些高度放射性废水可能流入了海洋。2014年2月 TEPCO 披露一个被错误保持开启的阀门，导致约100公吨高度放射性废水从储罐中溢出。2016年10月，大约32升高度放射性废水从储水罐的接缝处泄露出来。由于政府未能充分制定气候变化和环境保护政策，对政府的不信任也在更大范围内存在。随着极端天气事件变得越来越普遍，今年夏天创下了创纪录的高温，很明显，政府未能在全球范围内充分解决这个问题，他们往往更愿意淡化气候变化危机的严重性，而不是制定真正的政策来监管那些是世界主要碳排放源的大型企业实体。对许多气候活动家来说，政府的利益显然不会将环境或地球放在首要位置。重要的是要认识到，只有在积极承担责任的情况下，政府才会采取负责任的行动。正是在全球密切关注和国内行动主义的背景下，日本政府才制定了处理废水的计划。同时，也是在2021年中国和科学家的呼吁下，国际原子能机构才参与了对废水释放的监测。让我们讨论一下中国在这则新闻报道中的角色。由于对福岛核电站废水释放引发的担忧，中国决定暂时停止从日本进口水产品。这一举动实际上可以被视为一项战略性举措，旨在在日本的计划周围制造争议，并在全球媒体格局中展示自身的影响力。通过强烈反对废水释放并强调潜在风险，中国可能旨在国内外引起公众关注，从而对日本施加压力，同时展示自己作为关心环境和公共安全问题的负责任行动者。这可能有助于在日本的计划周围制造争议，并将中国定位为环境和海洋生物的保护者。此外，中国在这则新闻报道中的参与还可以被视为其在全球媒体上扩展影响力的努力的一部分。传统上，西方新闻机构一直主导着全球媒体格局，而中国一直在努力通过增加在国际媒体中的存在，塑造与其利益一致的叙述，以抵消这种主导地位。 与美国之音和自由欧洲电台有关的事实核查机构 Polygraph 声称，中国在歪曲福岛核废水倾倒风险方面的主张，凸显了当今媒体格局中信息战的复杂性。政府和各种行动者经常利用新闻报道和事件来推动其议程，这使得新闻消费者在批判性地评估信息源和信息时变得至关重要。中国通过社交媒体账号网络放大对日本释放废水进入太平洋的批评，这些账号推广亲中国的影响者将国家支持的叙述推到社交媒体的对话前沿。Navina Hayden 是居住在中国的德国移民，他发布了一段反对废水释放的视频。
So recently there was this very concerning incident where Japan released the radioactive contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean. So recently you can see a lot of discussions on Twitter on how harmful this water actually is. But I'm here today to provide another viewpoint regarding the legality of this incident. So what you need to know first is that Japan's decision to release this radioactive contaminated water was made unilaterally, and this unilateral decision is against the two most important international environmental laws, the London Protocol and the UN clause. According to those two laws, any environmental intervention that has a potential transboundary impact must be discussed with the stakeholders, the countries and the local communities prior to this decision. So therefore, Japan's decision caused a lot of countries, including but not limited to China, to feel opposition, they feel panic, and they feel fear. The impact of this is that now China has banned the fishery import from Japan, and I see a lot of Chinese people refuse to eat fish that was imported from Japan.
此外，中国的批评者声称，中国对日本水产品进口的禁令是虚伪的，因为许多中国核反应堆释放的废水含有远高于福岛水平的放射性污染物。另一位推特用户 Gabriel Wildo 表示，这种观点错误地阐述了北京的实际担忧。他们担心放射性同位素，这在正常废水释放中是不存在的，因此将其他核电厂的穿水瓶进行比较是无关紧要的。这种担忧在韩国也广泛存在。他还引用了一篇新华社的文章，批评日本的计划是不合理和不负责任的行动。从福岛核电站释放的废水经过过滤和处理，已经去除了污染水中的62种放射性核素，将符合国际原子能机构 IAEA 的安全标准。国际原子能机构已经发布了一份详细的报告，详细说明了他们的保护和认证程序。中日关系的紧张局势在这位在日本的中国视频博主中引发了一种受害感。
我们现在打电话報警，问问这个老板什么意思。中国人なんですけれども、なんでこう書いてるんですかって話させてください。それはまあ聞いてみないと分からない。
中国人に対して書いているっていうに怒ってるのか、それともこの福島県産の食材を使ってることに対して怒ってるのか。いや、
福島産の食材はどうでもいいんですけど、なぜ中国人へって書いてあるってそういうことなんですよ。
そういいですか、中に聞いてきたんですけど、やっぱりそうですね。要は中国人に対してっていうあれじゃなくて、ここに来る方のために。要は福島県産のものを使ってるから、もしそもそも入る前の段階として、だから嫌なんだったらそもそもうちには入らないでくださいね。
中国人としてこれは国籍差別につながると思いますよ。
何がつながる？
なぜ中国
さんの嫌がる方がいらっしゃるから、そういう人たちのためにここのお店自体は福島県産の。
本人が喋ったなぜ中国人へ？
特にニュースで最近そういうふうになってるんで、こういうふうに書いてる。
それは国籍差別なんですよ。
いや、かもしれないです。勝手なお店の経営者の判断、権利があってやってることなので、警察はこれこんな書きゃダメだっていうのはできないんで、ですけどお話聞いたらこれ日替わりで結構書いてること変わるらしいんで、また明日には書くこと変わるみたいです。
今日は変わります？
じゃあお伝えはできるけど、変われるかってどこかわかんないです。それはもういや
どう思います？
よくない。じゃあ書き換えるって言ってるんで、
お願いしますよ。中国ですから。
在这段视频中，一个中国视频博主感到在一家餐馆遭到歧视，餐馆老板在窗户上挂了一块写着“告诉中国人，本店全都是福岛产的”招牌。这种受害感和歧视感可能部分受到前大阪府知事桥下彻 Toru Hashimoto 和前宫崎县知事东国原英夫 Fidel Higashiko Kuburo 的影响。他们在一次采访中表示，进入日本的中国游客应该喝福岛受污染的水，吃福岛的海鲜，还可以在福岛的海里游泳。福岛核废水释放问题越来越被政治化，被视为中日紧张关系的一个问题，这掩盖了日本、韩国和斐济等国的老百姓对释放行为的担忧。虽然可能是媒体叙述煽动了他们的恐惧，但轻视他们的真实担忧是适得其反的。为了缓解人们对受污染海产品的担忧，日本首相岸田文雄发布了一段视频，展示他吃福岛的生鱼片。尽管中国对日本水产品进口的禁令可能具有象征性或误导性，但希望它能够解决该地区一个非常真实的问题：过度捕捞。虽然沙丁鱼种群自然会因为海洋环境的变化而波动，但捕捞可能会增加饲料鱼类崩溃的频率和强度。2015年发表的一项研究直接发现，捕捞压力加剧了饲料鱼类的自然种群崩溃。太平洋沙丁鱼种群自2006年以来已经减少了 95%， 现在已经低于维持商业捕捞所需的最低水平，称为截止点。感谢收看本次的华尔街前线报道。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场。在今天的节目中我们继续为您聊中国经济现实的情况。中国经济情况到底如何呢？有的时候大家看到的是中国自己经济运行的基本状况，但是如果你是美国或者是其他西方国家的决策者，你也会想到中国经济现在出现的结构性问题，可能会对于中国的外交政策有怎样的影响，对于中国和世界的关系有怎样的影响，以及对于本国的对华政策到底有怎样的影响。那么现在美国的决策者到底是如何想的呢？这就是我们今天要与大家分享的话题。这是来自于彭博社的一篇长篇报道。文章开篇就介绍中国现在遇到了经济困境，而美国和其他7国集团的国家越来越看到了中国经济存在根深蒂固的结构性问题的证据。这一些问题最终将给出答案。到底中国如何对抗日益加强的西方的力量？中国是否已经成为一个日益衰弱的地缘政治对手呢？最近几天彭博社的记者走访了华盛顿、罗马、东京，还有其他很多国家的权力走廊。官员接受彭博社专访时都谈到了中国经济的问题，而他们的一致观点是， 数十年来引导全球资本流动的所谓中国经济奇迹，这一种论调正在迅速转变。之前大家往往听说的是，中国似乎不可避免的要超越日渐衰落的美国，成为世界最主要的经济体。但是现在情况似乎不再如此。根据来自彭博社的介绍，现在华盛顿内外的盘算越来越多的涉及应该如何应对一个衰落的中国。即使中国还没有衰落，他们也认为中国可能已经接近实力的顶峰了。美国总统拜登在公开场合曾表示说，中国的经济是一颗定时炸弹。的确，中国面临着从债务到人口结构的一系列长期挑战。而在刚刚过去的周二，在从北京到上海的高铁上，美国的商务部长雷蒙多曾经对中国人说，美国的企业告诉他，现在中国正变得越来越不可投资。华盛顿著名的智库新美国国家安全中心的首席执行官叫做方丹，他有这样的一个看法，说传统的观点似乎正在从中国力量不可决挡这样的一种担忧，转向对于中国经济不可逆转衰落另外一个极端的担忧。而第二种担忧在拜登政府的内部可以说是悄然兴起，近期成为了主流。在今年6月的时候，美国财政部长耶伦在北京之行前夕接受彭博社采访时表示，现在中国的人口问题已经对于经济增长和投资构成了挑战。之后，耶伦也指出了其他的问题，比如青年失业率以及房地产行业遭遇到的困境等。美国的官员普遍认为，中国忽视了数十年来关于应该进一步开放经济的建议。他们认为中国做了一个错误的选择，尽管有很多人认为中国现在经济距离达到顶峰或者说开始衰落，那可能还为时过早。但是他们认为一系列长期的结构性问题已经成为了中国经济增长的掣肘障碍。美国的财政部副部长阿德莫耶在本周也告诉彭博社说，中国正在创造不利于外国直接投资的环境，也不利于外企在中国继续运营。不仅仅是美国，很多七国集团的官员们也在思考，中国这样一个价值18万亿美元的巨大经济体，现在遭遇到的困境会如何对于本国的市场进行冲击。在伦敦，有一些人看到，如果中国出现通货紧缩，那可能有助于帮助我们自己控制物价。但是更多的国家的人在担心，如果世界上这个曾经最重要的增长引擎出现了衰退，那么对于本来就已经不太稳固的世界经济前景，是不是会造成进一步的冲击？我们知道，外交事务杂志有美国外交政策思想圣经之称但是在作者看来，最近的一期外交事务杂志简直就像是为中国写的一曲安魂曲。很多文章都纷纷表示，中国的增长奇迹已经结束了，而停滞的时代也已经开始了。在8月21日的国会两党小组听证会上，大家也就中国经济可能出现的问题发出了各种各样的警告。比如荣鼎咨询的中国市场研究员罗根赖特，他就作证说中国政府可能没有办法对于全球经济的霸主地位提出可信的主张和诉求了。七国集团的官员普遍认为现在中国经济放缓的时间持续多久还不明白。中国还有一定的财力可以刺激经济，避免崩溃。而中国政府几乎每天都会推出一些支持房地产行业的最新措施，在今天又宣布了支持货币，还有扩大税收减免的相关计划。但是迄今为止，中国官员没有采取全面的刺激措施，主要是希望打破中国对于债务的依赖。那么，中国还有很多优先事项都需要平衡。彭博社的经济学者认为中国现在出现的经济问题不会妨碍中国为产业政策买单，但是很有可能会降低产业政策的效益。之前大家一直认为中国经济有朝一日超越美国，成为世界第一大经济体是或早或晚，但是一定会实现的事情。但是现在在美元走强的助推下，美国经济又与中国拉开了差距，而且趋势似乎可能还可以继续下去。但是尽管如此，美国、欧洲和日本的很多官员也认为自身也面临挑战，而中国需求疲软对于全球经济和企业也会造成负面影响。现在还没有到沾沾自喜的时候，但是情绪的转变的确正在发生。 有一些官员们认为，西方的政策应该就此改变了。彭博社这一篇文章还透露了一个非常有趣的细节：拜登政府在8月公布了对外投资的限制措施，但是这一些投资的措施范围相对来讲比较狭窄。当然，其中一部分是美国投资者游说的结果。但是，有一位政府官员私下里也对彭博社表示，白宫是刻意降低了限制措施的力度。部分原因是白宫认为中国自己的敌视性的政策，还有经济的紧张局势，对中国投资的抑制作用，比美国的任何限制措施都要来得更有效。很多华盛顿的官员和欧洲的官员认为中国经济的放缓证明了他们在疫情过后，为了减少对于中国这个出口大国的依赖，以及对于本国贸易投资产业政策一系列调整努力的正确性。虽然所谓的去风险运动是由美国主导的，但是在七国集团的很多国家也找到了回声。在很多的战略领域，中国仍然是对于七国集团一个巨大的挑战。比如，中国正在加大力度强化自己本国的产业政策，来支持替代供应链的建立。也有人说说中国会未富先老，这似乎已成定局。但是第二点也同样重要，就是中国政府针对某一些战略产业制定的产业政策，比如电动汽车，仍然取得了非常大的成效。现在，华盛顿内外的思想家都认为，中国经济放缓主要是中国政府没有进行重大的市场化改革，降低国有部门重要性的结果。比如温迪·卡特勒就说现在我们看到的是一个乐观的美国，但是他也警告说，美国不应该在这里高兴过早，中国仍然是一个强大的经济对手。比如金砖国家集团的扩大，就是中国在发展中国家和新兴市场中影响力不断扩大的一个重要的标志。但是不管怎么说，中国之前的这一种成功的模式，现在在很多华盛顿的政策制定者看来已经伤痕累累了，吸引力也正在减弱。如果中国经济的确是出现了放缓，对于大宗商品和其他进口商品的需求也会相应出现降低。中国在非洲等地的地缘政治投资和影响力也有可能会出现下降。有一些美国官员认为如果中国经济出了问题，那么有的时候可以帮助美国说服持怀疑态度的欧洲和其他盟国远离中国。也有很多官员认为，中国经济的放缓现在证实了自己政策的正确，更是证实了中国模式的不可持续性。很多企业也选择撤出，或者是把新的赌注压在印度或者是东南亚。8月28号的时候，大家可能还有印象，就是德国的新任驻华盛顿的大使在 CSIS 的一次活动上说，中国经济的增速远不如前，中国市场也不像之前这么有前景了。如果说一个代表性的国家，大家首先可能想到的是意大利。消息人士说说现在中国经济增长的放缓，再加上俄罗斯因为乌克兰战争而分心，也让意大利从与中国的伙伴关系中获得能力、获得利益的动机更少了。意大利最近是通过了一项法律，允许政府行使特殊的黄金份额的权利，阻止人工智能、半导体还有能源等一系列战略技术转让向中国。现在意大利政府也必须决定是不是要续签“一带一路”的倡议。有一种说法认为，中国经济的放缓削减了罗马方面继续续签的理由。但是欧洲也有政策分析者警告，现在呢，中国也有可能比大家想的更快的恢复经济发展。而如果战略平衡再次出现了变化，那么如果美国总统大选再次出现了意外，欧洲仍然可能会对于中国和美国的态度出现逆转。但不管怎么说，与美国相比，欧洲仍然认为中国更加重商主义，而欧洲与美国之间的距离永远会近于与中国之间的距离。吉姆·奥尼尔之前也曾经说，如果德国要继续保持出口大国的地位，就没有办法真正改变与中国的关系。中国经济放缓在英国很大程度上被视为是值得欢迎的消息。在今年7月国际货币基金组织把全球通胀预期下调了0.2个百分点，主要原因就是中国的通胀十分的低迷。在日本，中国现在率先出现的老龄化问题也引起了关注，因为日本本国也面临着类似的问题。而接下来还有一个更大的问题，就是现在面临经济困境的中国，到底是会更加好战，还是会变得相对比较低调和包容？有一些人担心 中国经济遇到的问题可能会促使共产党的领导层把困境归咎于外部势力，从而更有可能加剧紧张局势。沙利文呐，上个月的时候就试图这个平息这样的一种想法，说美国并没有试图放缓中国经济，也没有试图削弱中国的经济增长。他们也反复强调，并不寻求与中国进行脱钩。但是不管怎么说，停滞不前的中国经济很有可能导致地缘政治再出现更多的不确定性。如果中国领导人把注意力集中在国内问题上，还有可能在国内舞台以及在国际舞台上再次出现不平衡，在全球舞台上再次出现收缩，是不是会导致中美之间的竞争降级呢？是不是会导致中国与其他国家之间的竞争出现某一些放缓呢？不论你身处竞争争论观点的哪一方，只要是身处国际权力殿堂，很多人都认为中国政府仍然是未来全球经济中西方世界一个巨大的竞争对手，中国也仍然强大而雄心勃勃，外交活动仍然是全球性的，国防开支和军事实力会继续保持增长。现在有关于中国就此消亡的报道，似乎还完全为时过早。那么以上就是我们为大家介绍的彭博社这一篇文章中的一些主要的观点那我们可以看到，在华盛顿现在出现了这样的一种声音，就是之前大家认为中国的崛起似乎是势不可挡，很快就要赶上和超越我们美国了。结果现在又出现了180度的逆转，认为中国已经出现了不可逆转的示威，并且认为这是美国对华政策正确所导致的后果，再加上是中国自己咎由自取，没有及时的采取一系列市场性的改革。当然了，在世界各国，大家也认为，即使中国出现了经济的问题，在相当长的一段时间仍然是国际地缘政治中一支非常重要的力量。那我想首先请问何明先生对于华盛顿唱响中国安魂曲，认为中国崛起的时代已经一去不复返了，接下来可能更加漫长的是停滞时代，这样的一种观点，你认为是不是正确？
华盛顿呢是世界上的政治中心原来我们想象的这样一个政治中心这个中心呢，应该是非常的稳重，非常的具有应急国际问题、国内问题的这个能力我们也看很多的这个白宫的一些电影或者电视剧都发现这个非常的有这个机动性。其实事实上他们也是人。事实上他跟一个小公司或者一个小历史楼或者是一个我们一些小团体取得一个胜利之后，我们会非常亢奋的这个劲头其实是差不多的因为人呢有时候就需要一种情绪一种气氛来支撑。现在关于中国的这个看法和中国的世界的看法还是有非常大的不同。中国的官方的看法是非常的僵硬或者是几乎就不值得看。中国的社交媒体的主流就是攻击西方、诬陷西方，或者是把西方简化，也不大值得看。而西方的媒体呢要丰富很多它有很多的层次，就看你会不会看你可以从这些智库报告或者是官方的动向或者是这些媒体里面看到了很多的真相，看到一些的预知者的一些思考一些洞察力，但是你看到了你不小心也会被这个表面上的一个大潮流或者是所谓的主流所牵扯。今天的华盛顿高兴了，他是高兴他早了，还是高兴的是10号，还是说他们需要这么一点精神来鼓励自己？因为拜登总统面临一个非常大的一个挑战他不像习近平还刚刚上台，下一届还干不干我们现在还不知道暂时几年似乎不需要等待这个选举的挑战不像拜登总统马上面临到一个险情，所以强调拜登经济学的成功我不知道李奇博士知不知道，早一段时间都流行一个拜登经济学那么学术界争论一下，有人批评，有人说怎么取得成功讲拜登呢，现在的政治对手根本就不是川普你别看川普民调这么高那么拜登总统才是的这个轻而易举的核心 所以他们期待的是川普前总统来成为拜登的这个对手所以这个没有问题，肯定赢另外一个呢，就是就算是拜登不行，他们呢也认为的是海莉女士海莉女士呢会成为了拜登总统的一个对手所以他们是这样讲。这些里面的这个动作有时候你觉得哇好聪明有时候你觉得好天真有时候你觉得好搞笑很多层次都有。那么就像这一次的亢奋对中国的经济的亢奋，是真的中国的经济真的是那么糟糕吗？你听了很多中国人的说法真是那么回事，我就没有见到几个中国人说现在好得很了好得很了无论是学界还是企业界很少看好中国现在的这个状况，看好中国的这个未来所以呢，你说华盛顿他完全是无事生非，也不是也不是。但是呢，你作为我们作为一个观察者有时候需要的还不仅仅是简单是定力的问题，或者是要跟唱一个反调的问题，而是你的洞察力的问题。那么有一些洞察力吧，稍微有一些这个历史上的一点点经验你就会知道华盛顿有时候高兴就是高兴太早比如说俄罗斯侵略乌克兰战争之前那个华盛顿那种高兴的程度，我当时觉得很奇怪我说这个战争你就不是很清楚吧？我一开始就怀疑，我说这个战争真的是像你们预期的那样吗？前面说好像俄罗斯认为很容易打下来，俄罗斯是这么布局的吗？俄罗斯真的要去打基辅吗？我说我对军事是不了解，我也不想去看那些那么残酷的一些战争上的一些画面，但是我基本的常识都知道对吧？一个是俄罗斯侵略乌克兰的战争，不是民主与专制的这个战争，它就是一个违反主权原则的，而且违背现在的基本国际能力的一个非常残暴的故事的一种战争行为。那么这样一种定义呢，全世界没有几个国家会反对，包括中国现在为什么它不能明确的支持俄罗斯侵略这个乌克兰，就是因为你在国际法的能力你过不去嘛。但是如果你把它定义成为民主与专制，这个事情一下子切割开来了，那谁是专制谁是民主，那谁的定义是按照美国的定义是按照学者的定义这就变得非常的模糊。第二个是呢，当时讲到乌克兰人民的这种反抗的意志，我一点都不怀疑，因为我们跟乌克兰有合作我们过几天我就跟大家讲我们跟乌克兰怎么合作的那么跟乌克兰的民众当然不是光混了那么这个就是我所看到的就是基本的常识，这种战争不会那么容易的不要说这个阻击这个俄罗斯侵略乌克兰很不容易，那你就是现在反攻，我也认为是非常不容易，非常艰难，就是稍微有一点点常识，我是不算政治专家了，就是根本不算了，但是我都认为不容易。但是你在华盛顿那个时候去华盛顿，你简直惊讶了，在这个办公室到另外一个办公室，就是美国又一次取得了胜利，又一次掌握了世界的总督说又是有当时叫一个什么词叫民主第四波。这个词现在可能没人讲了，但是1年以前出现在美国的智库的报告里面那更是出现在这个白宫的这些各等官员里面简直觉得哇，真是把欧洲的问题这个恶魔普京给拉下来了。几个月过去了，现在不是几个月，10几个过去了，对吧？早一段时间的大反攻，从100万大反攻到后面的反攻，我为什么不太建议你讲这些事情呢？就是我很伤感，因为这些情况恰恰就是我所担心的情况在发展很有可能这个战争就变成一个耗战就是消耗战，就是消耗生命。但是华盛顿呢，华盛顿的情绪呢，现在面临的一个非常尴尬的局面如果明年的大选，这个俄罗斯侵略乌克兰这个战争不能解决，你怎么办？对吧？然后我们再回头讲到经济的问题。那经济的问题，我记得去年还前年拜登总统说，我们终于第一次GDP 超过了这个中国，对吧？总统说的这个没有拜登总统忘了讲的这句话。当然，我们现在有一个办法可以满足自己的心理，说中国那个 GDP 根本就是假的。最好的干脆就讲中国是负数，那你这就比较好办了。如果你不能证明中国的 GDP 增长是负数，那人家也有4%到5%的增长那4.5%的增长，你在那中国已经10%几，那当然是差得太大了。老百姓那等巨大的高速增长中间， 突然把速度停下来，你说谁满意啊？原来的财富你都不知道怎么挣钱的。我这个朋友经常跟我吹牛啊，就是我们的网友啊，有一个网友在上海一边喝的那个酒啊，过年的那天茅台放了很多。他说：“哎呀，这个何老板啊，和平啊，老兄啊，我就不知道我这个钱怎么挣的，今年怎么挣，进账又是多少个零呢，对吧？现在这种感觉没有了，对吧？中国人的一穷二白，后来到突然之间有钱，突然之间增长的速度没那么快。你作为一个中国人，你作为一个投资人，你作为一个企业家，又看了政府这么意识形态又这么瞎搞，对吧？疫情之间这种封锁，老百姓的怨恨，我讲老实话是完全能够理解。但是中国的经济应该怎么看？像我们今天的这个中国简报里面讲的啊，是不是这个雷曼时刻啊，是不是明斯基时刻，这些词啊，很容易套到中国现在的这个危机上，甚至有人说就崩溃了，还有人说从此中国就不可能超过美国了。其实我从来没有讨论过，想讨论过什么中国超过美国不超过美国，而是说中国是一个10几亿的国家，是一个非常勤奋的一个民族，是一个经济层次、文化层次非常多的一个国家啊！我可以跟你讲，中国的很多的民众那种民主的、自由的价值观一点都不低于美国，素质也不低于。但是另一方面，那些思想僵化、保守、不可理喻的看到这个西方的人也大有人在。其实你这种情况跟美国比较一下，你到美国有些地方就问问，他一辈子护照都没拿过，哎，他根本就不知道世界上有一些地方比美国还好，他就认为美国好得很啊，就跟一战时候的美国一样的。美国有多大程度上真正了解这个中国？从上个世纪30年代、40年代到这个1989年的时候为一个阶段，当时整个学术界做一个根本性的检讨，就是说我们到底是不是看错了中国？跟着呢，后来至于屠杀人民，后来又看不懂，大家还要检讨否定半天，尤其是否定魏正清。过段时间，中国经济高速增长，大家就开始说中国经济是造假，中国经济是偷窃，中国经济是怎么样啊？问题一大堆，劣质产品，很长时间是美国电视剧、电影里面的不经意的一个小插曲。对吧？这个大家稍微看美国电视啊，就基本都有这个特征。现在搞了半天，中国的汽车出口世界第一，中国的半导体在美国的打压之下，未来几年就会看到情况。华为是尽美国之力、西方之力，华为偷袭悄悄出现这个东西，到底品质怎么样我也不知道。有人说是石破天惊啊，反正华为是比较低调。就是说中国的经济怎么样？你要真正的问我，我整体来讲当然是乐观的，因为我在整个世界乐观，我不仅是在中国乐观，我在美国也乐观。但是你说这些问题存在是不是真实的呢？我当然认为可能是真实的，但是这个真实是不是全部？你今天认为中国完蛋了，那你看看2008年，我走到美国的很多的，包括小镇上都有人在抗议啊，抗议什么？占领华尔街啊！我当时就质疑这些占领华尔街的朋友，我会有一个问题：你把华尔街占领了，你告诉我下一条街在哪什么地方，对吧？如果你认为美国这种体制不行，我们找到了体制的通道在什么地方？如果你占领了华尔街，占领完了以后让华尔街不运作，美国是不是一个更运作好的这个系统？这个是你有100个理由不满意的华尔街，但是有一个理由让你没办法。下接在哪一个地方？中国的情况也是这样。中国能够让它在地球上消失吗？中国能够让它的经济上一下子崩溃吗？中国如果真的崩溃了，我可以说，无论是中国的崩溃和美国的崩溃，以这2个国家的这种分量，都是世界级的这种灾难。而这种灾难就开始预计到了，就是说美国是不是也会完蛋啊？如果你现在在心里面预期中国完蛋，你就开始预期我们是不是也要完蛋？所以最近呢，也有一些学者在开始，我不会那么严重。第一呢，中国没有那么糟糕；第二呢，对美国影响很小，对吧？就开始唱这些调子了。其实这个地球照样在转啊。有时候你看了这一点，你就发现了真理啊，然后你开始了大家一起来喊。其实散伙了以后，再回过头来到自己家里想一想，情况不是那么一回事啊。所以看待今天的中国的经济问题我理解大家的怨恨，我理解大家的悲观失望但是呢，那不是真正的真实就像早一段时间动不动就说我们躺平，我就火了，我说你躺平吗？你躺平看别人在躺平吗？ 别没有在躺平啊。所以当你起床以后，你就发现这个世界又是一个新的世界。哎，今天的中国的产业的变革，今天的整个的叫人令人气愤的行为，它其实是同时在发生。
好，谢谢何斌先生的点评啊。那么今天这一篇文章我们就简单为大家介绍到这里。今天呢，针对这一些文章，因为非常的有争议性啊，那彭博社呢早些时候还在 Twitter 上面专门举办了一个音频的研讨会，也特别请参与报道这一篇文章的几位记者啊，分别是在欧洲、美国和日本来谈他们接触到的相应政府的官员到底对于中国经济是一个什么样的看法。那么有关于这样的一段音频研讨会呢，我们也会在稍后在华尔街电视为大家完整播出，帮助大家理解这一篇报道背后的更多的细节。感谢各位对于这个思想先驱报节目的支持。下周一呢，我们争取以其他的方式，要么是远程连线，要么呢是上传节目的方式啊，继续思想先驱报的报道。下周一是美国的劳动节，希望您度过一个愉快的长周末。感谢如是我闻，感谢艺人，感谢这一些网友对于我们的支持。稍后再为您带来华尔街现场和华尔街智库有关于现在国际智库关于中国问题的更多探讨。
This past Thursday, Japan began releasing treated radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. This is water that was used to cool the damaged reactors after the nuclear accident, which occurred there in 2011. Japan seems to be taking every precaution. They managed to filter out almost every radioactive element except for tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen, which is quite difficult to separate from water. And so for this, they have diluted the water to ensure these levels are low. They've lowered the level of tritium to less than 10 becquerels per liter. To put this in perspective, the WHO sets the limit for safe drinking water at 10,000 becquerels per liter. So, I'm no expert on nuclear waste, but at least it's clear that according to established standards, they're being quite cautious. They're also releasing this water incredibly slowly. They have about 1.3 million tons of contaminated water they need to release eventually, which is enough to fill 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And as of right now, they're only releasing 7,800 cubic meters, or about 3 Olympic swimming pools, and that's over the course of 2.5 weeks. So they estimate the entire process will take them about 30 years to release everything. Despite their caution, the response from the Chinese Communist Party has been nothing short of hysterical, immediately banning all seafood from Japan, describing the release as a selfish and irresponsible act. The Japanese are actively monitoring samples from sea wildlife and have found no evidence of abnormalities or issues from the release thus far. But despite this, China, it seems, has suddenly decided to steward the health and longevity of our oceans. Miles, what's your take on this development? Is this sincerely environmentally motivated on behalf of the CCP, or is this simply political retribution of some sort?
No, it's not environmentally based at all. It's not even science-based. The Chinese government use issues like this to score a geopolitical point at Japan. The Japanese government has been pretty responsible in dealing with this issue. The U.S. government has no problem with it. State Department spokesperson said the Japanese handling of this nuclear wastewater release is, quote, safe, transparent, and science-based, unquote. South Korean government does not have a problem with this because they are participating in supervising the release, and they're showing the data. There are some localized protests in Korea, but it's very small in number, and government has no problem. The Taiwanese government is cautious but has no problem with this because the data is indisputable. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has no problem. It has approved the Japanese releasing its water because the science is there. The amount of tritium in the water content is way below what's required. The radioactive element tritium even meets the WHO standard. Is way below the WHO standard for drinkable water. Is 1/7 below that. This fanning of the hysteria against Japan domestically is very unfortunate. It shows the government really is running out of ideas about anti-Japanese sentiment. Create mass hysteria, censor any dissenting, even moderating a voice inside China on this matter. If you say Japanese is being responsible, you'll get in trouble. Police will knock on your door. So that's how serious this issue has become inside China. It's ridiculous. And also the government of China unleashed avalanche of harassing phone calls to Japanese public service hotlines, emergency lines. Chinese government acts like a hooligan. This is the problem. If you want to put this thing into perspective, the Chinese government itself runs a lot of nuclear power plants. They also routinely dumps wastewater into the ocean. China has about 13 reactors, contains as high as 10 times more radioactive element tritium than the WHO standards. So this is a total hypocrisy. The funny thing is, because of the state-staged hysteria inside China, the real victim of this Chinese government's cynical move against Japan is basically the Chinese seafood industry itself. Japan's seafood export into China is not really that significant because Japanese seafood industry mostly is geared for its domestic consumption. But the entire seafood industry in China right now is devastated. Nobody wants to eat seafood. It shows you the fundamental difference between two models of governance between China and Japan.
The seafood industry in China is taking a hit. Is this due to China's own dumping of radioactive materials, or what is the apprehension that's causing this in China?
The apprehension goes like this. Japan dumped the radioactive water into the ocean, and then that contaminated the ocean current will take to the Chinese water, where the seafood will be harvested, put on the Chinese dinner table. In the information environment that is China, you do not have any counterbalancing views. You don't have any science-based discussions. Government censored all the information it does not want people to see. So in China right now, seafood industries suffer devastatingly. Many seafood restaurants are closing down. And another thing is, for some reason, some people, the urban legend says, salt could mitigate the problem of contaminated seafood. So right now in China, the most coveted items in the grocery store is salt. There's a national craze for buying salt. This sounds like a very, very bizarre and surreal.
The firestorm of hysteria that China has created in an attempt to damage Japan's reputation has backfired. And just to highlight the hypocrisy of this a little bit more, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that there's probably no force in this world at this time more destructive to our oceans than the Chinese Communist Party. They seem to have no concept of long-range sustainability in our oceans resources, overfishing not just in their own waters but across the globe. They have the largest deep-water fishing fleet in the world with nearly 3,000 ships as of 2022, just devastating fisheries across the globe with very little capacity for other countries to not only compete, but more importantly, rein these fishermen in. And so in their case, it's not even the selfishness that they accuse Japan of, it's actually just stupidity, because if they irreparably devastate these fragile ecosystems, they themselves will not have access to the seafood and delicacies they're currently trawling the world for. And you've highlighted the degree to which they themselves dump radioactive material. If we look at toxic human and industrial waste, which not radioactive is certainly profoundly devastating to water supplies, China has already contaminated as much as 90% of its own groundwater with dumping, as well as the improper use of fertilizers and pesticides, such that nearly 70% of their rivers and lakes are unsafe for human use. So, Miles, I mean, have you seen any, obviously this is sort of hysterical hypocrisy, but have you seen any meaningful measures from the CCP to reduce their impact on their own water supplies or the world's ocean? And if not, I mean, what can we as the U.S. do to play a role in reining them in?
Well, you mentioned something that's very important. That is, we talk about China being a contaminator in the world. We talk about the air. We talk about the water. Yes, it's totally true that China, in the blind pursuit of economic growth, almost completely ignored the ecological consequences of its greatly forward style developments and policies. And that basically, completely destroyed China's ecology. But there's also something else you mentioned that's very interesting, because China has long depleted the ocean lives and seafood resources along its shores and its water near its coast. So China has a global illegal fishing industry that affects most coastal countries in the world, as far as even to the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador. So this is a global issue. China just doesn't care about international law, and let alone ocean resources sustainability. And I think there is a lack of global coalition to deal with this Chinese illegal fishing on the global scale. And that's something I can see that in the near future, there will be some kind of a global coalition to deal with the issue, because this is very serious. China's ocean-going fleet is illegally fishing in other people's territorial waters and EEZs along, for example, in Argentina, in Brazil, in West Africa, in Ecuador as well.
Next topic, the recent BRICS summit in South Africa garnered quite a bit of attention. For a brief refresher for our listeners, BRICS is an international organization whose name is an acronym for the 5 member countries. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And its stated intention is to rival or provide an alternative to Western-led forums like the G7. We've talked about BRICS before, Miles, but if I recall, there's been in the past uncertainty about how serious of an organization it was and the degree to which friction between certain members would inhabit serious cooperation. But with this past summit, there was a rush of interest from nations to join. Before the summit, it represented 40% of the world's population and a quarter of the world's economy. And Xi Jinping, we've known, has wished to expand this. And both China and Russia, but perhaps especially Russia, are desperate to counter the prevailing reputation they have as pariah states by bringing new allies and partners into their orbit. Dozens of countries have expressed interest in joining. And on the final day of the summit, it was announced that 6 new countries will be joining BRICS. That is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This is the first expansion of the organization since South Africa joined in 2010, and it is undoubtedly a historic moment. But Miles, I want to ask you, how significant is this development really? Could you speak a bit to what BRICS actually is and does, and whether it presents a real challenge to the U.S.-led international order, especially now that these countries have joined?
I mean, this is basically an effort to create some kind of a new bloc, collectively called the Global South. And China wants to play the leadership role in that coalition. BRICS is a very peculiar organization because it has some kind of, overt purpose of replacing, or at least created an alternative to the G7, G20, and some other West-led political and economic blocs. But unlike G7, for example, BRICS really lacks something that's fundamental. That is, there's virtually no common values upon which to build a coalition. Some of the countries like India, Argentina, and Brazil, they're democracies, no matter how flawed, imperfect they are. But they have a fundamental democratic mechanisms. Other countries, basically, they were rogue countries, like Iran, like Russia, like China. You put all those together in a group to counter what they said is a West-led group. I mean, it's going to be very difficult because not everybody in the BRICS organization really is anti-West, right? So, which brings me to the new membership. You mentioned Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Argentina, and Ethiopia. Some countries were just downright opportunist. They joined it because China has this habit of giving a lot of money. Xi Jinping went to South Africa, and in Johannesburg, he pledged $10 billion to the BRICS. And a lot of people were just obviously coveting the Chinese giveaway. China acts as if it's now finally in the leadership role, commanding global discourse power. That's an illusion, because China does not have the credibility to be a global leader. China does not have the credential to lead the world, precisely because it lacks the right kind of value, right kind of institution to do so. If the world is going to look like China today, and the world is doomed. So not everybody in the BRICS wants to see the world to be run like the Chinese Communist Party is running China. There's also another dynamic inside the BRICS. There's no way CCP's claim to leadership will be readily accepted by countries like India, Russia, because there are a clash of egos, there are a clash of ambitions, there's also a clash of agenda. I mean, if China really cared about this global south, China should support India's membership in the UN Security Council as a permanent member. So China and Russia would not let it happen. It's all a clashing of very peculiar countries. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to be able to provide fundamental challenge to the G7-led world economy.
To press a little bit further on this lack of any sort of moral direction or shared moral understanding and this lack of leadership you've highlighted. I want to call our attention to a comment a colleague of ours, Walter Russell Mead, made on a new podcast from Hudson Institute that I would encourage our listeners to check out. It's called Arsenal of Democracy, which just launched recently, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for broader commentary on U.S. foreign policy. There he said, perhaps cutting against our own arguments about China and Russia's status against pariah states, that China and Russia are offering a deal to many of the world's elites, in particular in developing nations, that might be more enticing than what the U.S. offers. Whereas we attach certain moral expectations to cooperation and participation, the CCP doesn't care about human rights abuses. They don't care if elites engage in international money laundering operations, or if they're involved with cartels or other nefarious organizations. And they won't press these elites to democratize or even work towards more just domestic rule. So I want to ask you, Miles, do you agree with this categorization, and how enticing is this really on a broad scale internationally? Would an arrangement like this have enough currency with enough of the world's nations such that China could build an opposing international community on these grounds?
Not really. You said well. I mean, it will be very enticing to the elites of various countries, but ultimately it will not be appealing or enticing at all to the people of those countries. China has adopted this kind of approaches to many countries: Kenya, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Angola. In each of these countries, when the deal that you're talking about was revealed to the people of those countries, the people raised severe and sometimes violent opposition to the deal reached by their own elite with the Chinese government. So this is a challenge that China has to face. It is very easy for China to basically capture the elites of various countries, but it's almost impossible for China to capture the hearts or minds of the people in those countries. How to deal with China has become inevitably the number one sovereign and political issue that showed up in various countries' the elections. Sri Lanka, for example, Malaysia, it's the same thing. So initially, China would claim victory in forcing those countries into Chinese orbit with deals disguised as a Belt and Road projects. And in all of the countries, you see strong backlash, ultimately, to change the policies of this country toward China. I'll give you two examples, right? Malaysia is very important. Another one is Sri Lanka. So you can see that emerging in countries like Kenya and many other countries. So I'm not entirely sort of bought by that kind of argument.
Well said. Well, for our last topic, we have been covering for some time the downward spiral of the PRC's economy, and some commentators are beginning to argue that we're not just seeing decline, but perhaps the possibility of collapse between massive youth unemployment, the numbers for which the party has simply stopped publishing, crippling deflation, a crisis in the once booming Chinese real estate market, crushing debt for local governments, and devastating demographic issues, and as well, deep distrust, both from outside corporations and within China. It's hard to see a road to recovery. Miles, can you give us an update on this? And I just want to ask you, do you think a catastrophic economic collapse is actually possible or perhaps even imminent?
Well, let me just look into the inner logic of China's economic model. It's fundamentally flawed. In a certain way, the Chinese economic model looks like a gigantic Ponzi scheme. It goes something like this, right? Chinese system is a socialist system. In other words, the government owns what they call the means of production, particularly the land. All land is owned by the government. So government basically is able to get some money, particularly local government, by speculating on land sales. So the government uses monopolistic ownership of land to sell those land to developers through some kind of a scheme, particularly like a LGFV. This is a local government financing vehicles, which is the sort of organization that uses government-owned land as collateral to borrow enormous amount of money from banks and investors, and then give the money to local governments, upon which to build buildings and housing. This kind of industry has collapsed, and the Chinese real estate industry is exploding. LGFV couldn't pay back the loans they owe the bank, and risking default. And the default is on a gigantic, massive scale. The total local government debt mostly facilitated by LGFV, is close to $9 trillion. That's about half of China's entire GDP. Okay, so you ask me whether it's going to explode, collapse or not. You can get the easy answer from that reality alone. Now, the real estate collapse is a very, very big deal. That's also adding to the exploding factor. Evergrande filed for bankruptcy. This is one of China's largest real estate firms. 2 weeks ago, they filed bankruptcy in New York City. 10 days later, on August 28th, it resumed trading in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It lost 86% of its value at the opening, ending up the day as nothing but a junk stock. Because Evergrande is in debt of $2.38 trillion RMB, yuan. That's equivalent to $330 billion, right? And then a few days later, another China's huge, gigantic real estate firm, Biguiyuan, also defaulted nearly $20 billion debt. This has a cascading effect. Right? It not only make a lot of people victims of this Ponzi scheme, but also fundamentally shatter the confidence of the consumers. So people don't want to spend money. If people do not have confidence in the future of the economy, they don't want to spend money. That really affected the production, and so the industry is going through a vicious cycle. I think the Chinese economy is in big trouble. China is trying to look for its own salvation through the international banking system, through private equity and venture capitals, the big ones like BlackRock. Ultimately, I think China has to swallow its own bitter pills.
So obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but it seems to me, we can't just consider these economic problems in a vacuum. These have political implications. And we've seen over the past year backlash, protests from many Chinese citizens in response to economic issues or in response to, bad healthcare coverage, things like this. But that is largely ordinary Chinese citizens. Are we heading towards a point where the economic ramifications are starting to affect the elites? I mean, we talked about going after immigration consultancies. If it has a substantial effect on the elites in China who have benefited largely from China's economic growth up until this point, what sort of political ramifications might that have for Xi Jinping and for the party as it stands?
Well, the elites in China, they have their vested interest. And China has all sorts of ridiculous, unrealistic policies that go fundamentally against the international market mechanism. I'll give you one example. You mentioned about the crackdown on immigration consultancy. China had this ridiculous currency control that allows each individual to transfer no more than $50,000 out of China. And that is the ironclad law. If you go beyond that, you'll be a criminal. Now, there is a very strong trend inside China to immigrate to countries like the United States. And one of the most important way to do so is through investment. Visa type will be EB-5, for example. Now, the minimum requirement for the United States to give an immigration visa for investing in the United States is $800,000. So if you want to immigrate to the United States, going through that channel, which is the most popular, by the way, a lot of Chinese have come to the United States using that $800,000 investment visa category. Now, that would mean you have to send $800,000 to the United States to get your visa, but you are only allowed to transfer $50,000 a year. So it will have taken you about 16 years to get the money out of China. That's why the immigration consultancy say, you know what, I can do it for you through different kind of shenanigans. And so of the tens of thousands of Chinese middle-class, well-off people who have immigrated to the United States using that visa category are literally made a criminal. So that's why when the Chinese government goes after the immigration consultancy, demanding the consultancy to hand over the case files, you can see a lot of people who have immigrated to the United States do not want to go back. Now, there's also another thing. Many of the people who have immigration visas through investment in the United States, they do not live in the United States. The visa in the United States, passport in the United States is just a plan B. So many of those wealthy people, their economic basis are in China. So this is why the Chinese government now is going after those very well-off people inside China to extract money from them without any immunity. That's the scheme. So you can see this all related to politics and policy.
随着中国迅速崛起，乌克兰战局持续升温，以及金砖国家联盟全球经济实力逐步增强，众多观点认为，我们正迈向全新的多极世界秩序。标志着美国主导和单极格局的时代逐渐逝去。那么，单极、多极和美国主导这些词汇究竟意味着什么呢？而如果我们正身处于新的多极世界秩序中，究竟会是混乱还是和平？我们的时代是否将迎来自由或压制？金砖国家合作组织 BRICS 最近宣布将接纳6个新成员国：沙特阿拉伯、伊朗、埃塞俄比亚、埃及、阿根廷和阿拉伯联合酋长国。目前尚不清楚这一变化在全球范围内将产生多大的影响。但是，让我们来研究一下美国的霸权是什么样子，以及我们是如何到达这个关键时刻的。美国与伊朗、沙特阿拉伯的关系历史充满了复杂的政治策略、不断变化的联盟关系以及冷战动态的影响。二战前，伊朗受到英国的影响，尽管在1945年正式获得独立，但仍在经济上依赖外部力量，尤其是英国的安格洛伊朗石油公司 AIOC。1951年，总理穆罕默德·穆萨德格提出国有化伊朗石油生产的计划，引发了与英国的紧张关系，这导致了一场破坏穆萨德格政府的运动，最终在1953年由中央情报局 CIA 和英国军情六处 MI6 策划的政变中达到高潮。穆罕默德·里扎·巴列维成为统治者，伊朗在冷战期间与美国密切结盟。相比之下，作为一个逊尼派神权君主制国家，沙特阿拉伯在全球伊斯兰中心地位显著。1938年发现石油储量后，沙特政府与加利福尼亚标准石油公司合资成立了 Aramco 公司。在冷战期间，美国担心左翼世俗民族主义在阿拉伯世界传播，支持沙特阿拉伯抵制此事。沙特政府坚持瓦哈比教，这是逊尼派的一种原教旨主义派别，甚至接受了伊斯兰教团成员等伊斯兰主义难民。转折点发生在1979年，伊朗经历了由鲁霍拉·霍梅尼领导的伊斯兰革命，使其远离了与美国的结盟，这标志着新中东冷战的开始。伊朗采取反西方立场。另一方面，沙特阿拉伯发现自己与美国结盟，以抵制其间接支持的激进伊斯兰教的崛起。但让我们从头开始，在第二次世界大战之前，伊朗的大部分地区一直是英国势力范围的一部分。虽然它不是正式的殖民地，但它也没有完全的主权。1945年二战后，伊朗正式独立，但英国英伊石油公司 AIOC 仍然垄断该国石油开采。从很多方面来说，1947年的伊朗能算是最早的新殖民国家，一个拥有正式自治权但在经济上严重依赖帝国势力的国家。1951年，穆罕默德·摩萨台当选总理，其政纲是将英国的石油生产国有化。这个将伊朗石油生产国有化的平台非常受欢迎，以至于他统一了支持与苏联结盟的共产党和设想建立一个伊斯兰神权政治伊朗的伊斯兰法代伊伊斯兰党。法代扬电子伊斯兰是一个重要的政治集团，因为在历史上一直是什叶派伊斯兰教中心的伊朗，宗教神职人员掌握着重要的政治权力。这种不同政党在共同目标下的联合被称为国民阵线联盟。摩萨台明白英国会反对伊朗控制石油储备和生产， 因此愿意妥协并平均分配 AORC 的利润。英国仍然强烈反对这一想法，并开始积极削弱摩萨台政府，雇佣暴徒煽动暴力，并对伊朗石油禁运。到1953年，当中央情报局介入时，英国已经花费了220万英镑，今天的7800万英镑，来促成政权更迭，并结束仍然受欢迎的摩萨台的总理职位。中央情报局支付德黑兰的歹徒，煽动暴力对抗穆萨台支持的共产主义者，并支持对穆萨台政府的军事政变。政变后，中央情报局和英国军情6处将权力交给了穆罕默德·雷扎·巴列维国王，他获得了对国家的独裁控制权。英国失去了他们在伊朗的石油垄断权，5家美国石油公司获得了在伊朗的石油开采权，利润归这些石油公司所有。穆萨台在余生中被软禁在家中。
He even makes a dramatic scene out of taking his place in the dock. From this picture, you might conclude that he's a dying man, or at any rate a very sick one. At other times, however, the tribunal has been kept in an uproar, for the aged defendant has constantly challenged the authority of the court to try him, and he's hurled insults at everyone, including the officer appointed to defend him. What a performance!
26年来，伊朗与美国一直在冷战中结盟。尽管美国表面上站在国际民主的一边，但在伊朗，国王独裁统治，借助秘密警察力量，迅速使伊朗西化，同时流放和监禁意见者。国王也是美国为数不多的支持以色列国存在的盟友之一。在这段视频中，您可以看到国王呈现自己为一个现代化、西化的绅士，支持以巴冲突的两方。
Not entirely, but I think even a little too much, even for Israel interests.
You think the Jewish lobby in the United States is too powerful for the interests of Israel?
I think so. Sometimes they are disserving the interests of Israel because they're pushing around too many people.
How do you mean pushing around?
Well, pressuring. They have many means at their disposal. They are putting up pressure on many, many people. And at the end, I don't think that it will even help Israel. I try to be candid. I have always been.
He was even-handed in his candor. Next, he turned to the Palestinians.
The Palestinians obviously had the sympathy of many, many people, almost all the countries in the world, prosecuted people, stateless people, looking for a home or something. Yeah. You know, exactly like the sympathy that the Jews had when they were searching for a home.
Right.
But our good Palestinian friends must know that there is only a limit to where they can go and bully the world.
Bully the world?
Yes, by terrorism and blackmailing and this and that.
伊朗国王这样说时，阿拉伯石油输出国组织 OPEC 的成员由沙特阿拉伯的费萨尔国王领导，宣布对美国支持以色列实施石油禁运。这一举措导致了油价飙升了300%。在国王专制统治下成长起来的一位意见者是年轻的鲁霍拉·霍梅尼。他后来领导了1979年的伊朗革命。霍梅尼生于1900年，是一位宗教神职人员。他亲眼目睹了围绕穆萨台的联盟受到外国干预的颠覆。然后，他作为一个意见者，被一位中央情报局支持的专制统治者流放，以保护他们在伊朗的石油利益。也许伊朗的第一位最高领袖自己就受到了英国和美国的影响。这两个国家声称保护民主，但却破坏了他本可以参与的民主。
این مصیبت ها برای چه به این ملت وارد شد؟ مگر این ملت چه میگفت و چه میگوید که از اون وقتی که صدای ملت در آمده است تا حالا قتل و ظلم و غارت و همه اینها ادامه دارد. ملت ما چی میگفتند که مستحق این عقوبات شدند؟ از یک شاهی که خودش و پدرش غیر قانونی است، خودش علاوه بر او غیر قانونی است، وکلایی که تعیین کرده است غیر قانونی است، دولت اون آدم، مجلس اون آدم، تمام اینها غیر قانونی است و اگر ادامه به این بدن اینها مجرمند و باید محاکمه بشن و ما اونها را محاکمه میکنیم. من دولت تعیین میکنم، من تو دهن این دولت میزنم، من دولت تعیین میکنم، من به پشتیبانی این ملت دولت تعیین میکنم، من به واسطه اینکه ملت مرا قبول دارد.
大规模的抗议活动始于1978年，一直持续到1979年。士兵们越来越支持抗议者。1979年1月，国王逃离伊朗，不到2周后，霍梅尼结束了他的流亡生涯，于2月抵达德黑兰。直到2022年被俄罗斯超越之前，伊朗一直是世界上受到制裁最多的国家。美国在1979年因人质危机而实施了制裁，随着人质的释放，于1981年解除了制裁。1987年，由于伊朗袭击波斯湾商船，重新实施了制裁。尽管政治学家将冷战描述为一个双极时代，但在1979年之后，伊朗脱离了这一体系。在美国对伊朗干预引发了超过20年的不满之后，伊斯兰主义革命将伊朗从与美国的紧密联盟中拉出。由于这次革命是由一位有魅力的宗教领袖领导的，他没有寻求与无神论的共产主义集团的政治结盟。在许多方面，1979年的伊朗革命标志着一种崛起的宗派民族主义的开始，而这种情况今天仍然存在。但事情正在迅速变化。伊朗仍然是世界上受制裁最多的国家之一，它仍然是一个伊斯兰共和国。但如果一切按计划进行，它将于2024年1月1日加入金砖国家合作组织 BRICS。沙特阿拉伯加入金砖国家合作组织 BRICS 的道路与伊朗平行而相反，它是逊尼派和什叶派伊斯兰教的全球中心，但统治王室阿勒沙特家族是逊尼派。沙特阿拉伯在第一次世界大战结束时解体奥斯曼帝国后获得了独立。1938年发现石油储量后，沙特政府与加利福尼亚标准石油公司合作，创建了阿拉伯美国石油公司即 Aramco。 这是1945年沙特阿拉伯国王阿卜杜勒·阿齐兹与罗斯福总统就阿拉伯美国合作的条款进行谈判的影响。
Final phase of new meetings in the Middle East. One more Allied step toward total victory and a lasting peace.
随着第二次世界大战后各国迅速获得独立，并面临双极冷战政治的现实，美国政策制定者开始担心阿拉伯国家可能会倾向于共产主义并与苏联结盟。叙利亚和伊拉克社会主义巴什党的崛起。1956年，自封为社会主义者的加马尔·阿卜杜勒·纳塞尔的崛起。
واحنا بنقول ان احنا لما بنتعامل مع دول العالم بنتعامل معاها على اساس ان ما حدش يتدخل في شؤون، ولكن اذا كانوا الامريكان بيفهموا انهم بيدونا شوية معونة علشان يجوا يتحكموا فينا ويتحكموا في سياستنا، انا بقول لهم احنا متاسفين، احنا مستعدين بننزل الشاي شويه، بنقلل من استهلاكنا في الشاي، بنقلل من استهلاكنا في البن، وبنقلل من استهلاكنا في بعض حاجات، ونحافظ على استقلالنا والا نضيع استقلالنا خالص. يبقى معركه سنه 56 ما فيهاش اي فايده. ليه انا بقول احنا بناخد من الامريكان قمح، لازم نعرف المواضيع بالمفتوح، قمح ولحمة وفراخ. ما بناخدش مصانع والله ابدا، يعني ما بيدوناش مصانع، بيدونا بحوالي 50 مليون جنيه في السنة. احنا ميزانيتنا في السنة 1100 مليون جنيه، بنصرف على الخطة حوالي 400 مليون جنيه او 500 مليون جنيه. اذا دعا الامر ان احنا نوفر 50 مليون جنيه بنوفرها على الجزمة ولا بتهمنا والله العظيم. ليه انا بقول هذا الكلام؟ ليه انا بقول هذا الكلام؟ انا بقول هذا الكلام النهارده بمناسبة، بقول هذا الكلام بمناسبة امبارح السفير الامريكي قابل نائب رئيس الوزارة للتموين، وراح عنده مقموص وزعلان، وقعد عنده دقيقتين، وكان مفروض هيتكلموا على التموين، المواد التموينية اللي احنا بنجيبها من امريكا حسب قانون الحاصلات. وقال والله ان انا ما بقدرش اتكلم ابدا دلوقتي في هذا الموضوع. ليه؟ لان سلوكنا احنا يعني هنا في مصر مش عاجبنا. انا بقول له هنا اللي سلوكنا مش عاجبه يشرب منين؟ يشرب من البحر. وان ما كفاهوش وانتوا هنا اللي ما يكفوش البحر الابيض بنديله البحر الاحمر يشربه كمان. اللي انا بدي اقوله ان احنا لا يمكن نبيع استقلالنا عشان 30 مليون جنيه ولا 40 مليون جنيه ولا 50 مليون جنيه، لان احنا مش مستعدين نقبل من واحد اي كلمة، اللي بيكلمنا اي كلمة بنقطع له لسانه كده. كلام واضح وكلام صريح. اذا كنا النهاردة بنشرب شاي 7 ايام نشرب 5 ايام لغاية ما نبني بلدنا. إذا كنا بنشرب قهوة 7 أيام نشرب 4 أيام. إذا كنا بناكل لحمة 4 أيام ناكل لحمة 3 أيام. اللي أنا بدي أقوله إن طبعا مناسبة هذا الكلام في الوقت اللي بيقولوا إن إحنا عندنا أزمة تموين وعندنا كذا وعندنا كذا، إن دل على شيء فيدل على إنه طريقة من طرق الضغط. احنا متأسفين ما بنقبلش الضغط وما بنقبلش الكلام السخيف وما نقبلش الرذالة أبدا.
1962年，阿尔及利亚摆脱法国统治是由左翼世俗民族主义游击队 FLN 民族解放阵线赢得的。沙特阿拉伯是一个教权君主制国家，奉行瓦哈比主义，这是逊尼派伊斯兰教的一种改革派和原教旨主义分支，也因为左翼世俗民族主义在世界各地的崛起而受到威胁。因此，在美国的财政支持下，沙特阿拉伯开始接纳来自阿拉伯世界各地社会主义革命的伊斯兰主义难民，包括埃及的穆斯林兄弟会成员。根据中东研究所的说法，已故的沙特国王费萨尔是中东支持西方以伊斯兰为灵感的政策的主要设计者，将这些穆斯林移民得到巴基斯坦一些有影响力的学者的协助，安排在沙特教育体系的各个层面。正是他们在表面上奉行瓦哈比教仪式，起草了一份宣言，宣称伊斯兰化的最终目标是知识和专业活动的各个方面。在1979年，随着苏联入侵阿富汗，美国和沙特阿拉伯准备武器化他们自20世纪50年代以来一直在进行的激进化计划。卡特总统的中央情报局花费近1亿美元向阿富汗反抗力量提供武器支持。里根总统最终将这个金额增加到每年7亿美元。沙特情报机构负责人土耳其阿尔费萨尔王子写道，沙特支持阿富汗人花费了27亿美元，而中央情报局花费了差不多相同的数额。由前莱茵省省长现任国王萨尔曼领导的沙特私人资金筹集了另外40亿美元支持反抗力量。 1979年11月，一支由沙特人朱海曼·奥塔伊比领导的伊斯兰团体宣称新救世主的到来和启示录的开始，夺取了伊斯兰教最圣洁的地点，也就是伊斯兰教的最圣地麦加清真寺，劫持了数千名朝圣者。随后为了夺回麦加而进行的围攻持续了2周。也许由美国和沙特背书建立和资助的激进和原教旨主义伊斯兰运动已经发展的有点太成功。在美国资助的伊斯兰主义背景下，中央情报局曾与鲁霍拉·霍梅尼联系，然后他返回伊朗。随着霍梅尼成为伊朗的最高领袖，美国开始向阿富汗投入武器和资金。世界看到了伊朗和沙特阿拉伯角色的颠倒。伊朗以前曾与美国密切合作在双极秩序中，但现在却被排斥在外，受到严重的禁运，独特地支持巴勒斯坦解放组织。沙特阿拉伯发现自己更加紧密地与美国结盟，以保护自己免受他曾经帮助创建的激进伊斯兰主义的威胁。因为这些原因，1979年标志着一场新的冷战的开始，一场中东冷战，由一支孤立的什叶派伊朗统治，由一系列宗教神职人员领导，但却乘着中东地区对西方和以色列的反感情绪不断增长，而对美国提供的资金和武器支持的逊尼派沙特阿拉伯。就像苏联和美国之间的冷战一样，这场冷战在许多暴力冲突中展开。最近一次是在也门，伊朗支持的胡塞武装与沙特和阿拉伯联合酋长国的部队联合作战。在黎巴嫩，什叶派民兵组织真主党得到伊朗的支持，而沙特阿拉伯则对黎巴嫩政府施加经济压力。在叙利亚内战期间，阿萨德政权在打击 ISIS 方面得到了伊朗支持的什叶派民兵的支持，而沙特阿拉伯则向自由叙利亚军提供武器和资金，后者也与 ISIS 作战，但最终希望推翻阿萨德政权。这就是为什么1年前难以想象沙特阿拉伯和伊朗会同意在北京举行和平峰会，而现在这2个国家都计划加入金砖国家合作组织 BRICS。 这提出了一个关键问题：新成员的加入会强化金砖国家合作组织吗？这些曾经的敌人是否愿意合作？在金砖国家合作组织以前是一个经济性质的组织，新成员的加入是否意味着它将成为一个全新的多极世界中的政治性质组织？感谢观看，勇敢面对多极世界。
In recent weeks, rampant misinformation has spread online about China's third aircraft carrier, the Fujian. In late May, netizens began posting images online that purportedly showed large cracks in the Fujian's deck. On Twitter, one of these posts racked up nearly 1 million views, and numerous follow-on tweets have been viewed tens of thousands of times. Even more digital ink was spilled over these claims as news reports began to spread the tweets. These reports are false. There are no large cracks in the vessel's deck. Commercial satellite imagery captured on May 15 shows no sign of cracks or similar markings on the deck. There are also no signs that major work has been done to those portions of the deck, which indicates no repairs were made. The streaks that overeager analysts mistook for cracks are, instead, liquid pooling and running in rivulets across the deck. Older imagery from September 8, 2022, and April 23, 2023, analyzed by China Power shows that the liquid appears to originate on the port side of the vessel and run toward the starboard side. This makes sense given that the vessel is tied up to the pier on the starboard side, which will sometimes cause a slight tilt with tidal swings. The fact that, in past imagery, the streaks appear in different places at different times adds further evidence that these are not cracks. The widespread sharing of this kind of misinformation is dangerous. Many users have spread posts and reports about the cracks to ridicule the quality of China's military and its weaponry as a whole. Buying into these claims risks seriously underestimating China's growing military power. To be sure, the People's Liberation Army Navy will have to tackle problems with the Fujian. Virtually all large, complex military platforms come with challenges. Understanding those real flaws and weaknesses will be important for analysts of China's military. Misinformation that muddies the waters with fabrication and hype is not helpful.
I wanted to start with, I guess, the broad view from Washington, and that is,
given your experience at the White House, how you think about the slowdown we're seeing in China and how it will impact U.S. policy towards China and this competition that's really dominated our thinking for some time.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me on this morning. I'm excited to be making my debut on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days with this Twitter Spaces. I think there's two dimensions to talking about U.S. policy towards China when it comes to China's economic challenges. And I'm going to turn to Gerard in a second to talk about the second dimension, which is what it means for economic policy. But I think when it comes to the U.S.'s broader strategy towards Beijing, really, the fundamentals here, I think, are not going to change in Washington's view. You know, the U.S. policymakers are basing their assessments on the challenge that China presents in a number of dimensions. The economy is really only one element of it. China is going to continue to be a major power, a major military power, a major player on the international stage, even if its economy slows down. You know, the reference point a lot of people will make is to the Cold War. And if you look at the Soviet Union continued to be a major rival to the United States well after its economy had stagnated. And I think that's how many people in the strategic space are thinking about China, that it will continue to present major challenges even if its economy slows down. I think the other dimension that comes up in the strategic space is the question of, is China's economic woes going to make Beijing more likely or maybe more eager to kind of pick international fights, maybe to distract its populace from troubles at home? And I just don't really see that happening. You know, sort of diversionary war theory hasn't really been seen in China. And I think what we are more likely to see is Beijing kind of hunkering down, focusing on domestic issues. They don't tend to like to have to face multiple crises at once. I think on the flip side of that, what we might see is greater sensitivity, you know, what we might call like aggressive defensiveness when they do feel their interests are challenged. To respond more assertively to that. But I don't think we're going to be seeing Beijing necessarily picking fights to distract people from its troubles at home.
It does feel, though, like this summer has seen a kind of shift in the narrative on China here in Washington and elsewhere. We had in our piece today, we quote Richard Fontaine, who's the CEO of the Center for New American Security here in Washington, talking about how the conventional wisdom seems to be flipping from a concern with the unstoppable rise of Chinese power to this worry about an irrevocable decline of China's economy, and also pointing to its demographics and population. Do you feel like there's been a kind of a shift over the summer?
I think that's definitely true. I will say, in my experience, that this isn't the first time. I think there are moments when anytime there's a stumble in China, inevitably some people are going to jump on that and say, "Oh, this means that it's over for China and China's miracle." I will say, I think, kind of broadly speaking, a huge driver of China's international influence, and particularly with developing countries, has been this notion of its inevitable rise and its economic miracle. And I think if it looks like they are no longer experiencing that miracle, that might take some of the international shine off China. But I wouldn't overhype that. I think for a lot of countries, China is still going to be a major market, a major player, a major economy, and the change might be marginal. I do think sort of the flip side of that is, there is a narrative longstanding in Beijing of China's inevitable rise and the U.S.'s inevitable descent. And I think maybe that argument is a little bit harder to make now that, the U.S. economy seems to be doing a little bit better than China's. But again, I don't know that I necessarily see them changing their strategy based on that fact. The only other thing I'd mention is kind of we've been talking about sort of the strategic conversation in Washington. There's obviously also a political conversation. And based on everything I'm seeing, I think China still continues to have a lot of political currency, even though its economy might be experiencing some challenges right now. So I think there will still continue to be a little bit of heat behind U.S. attention towards China. Again, I think people are still going to see it in the policymaking space as the most important challenge that the United States is facing.
Yeah, I think we're certainly going to see a lot more noise and heat in the U.S. as we go into next year's presidential election campaign. And China, as you say, is seen as one of the major challenges. Gerard, I want to bring you in here. What is going on with the Chinese economy right now? We had some measures announced overnight from the central bank and also authorities in Shanghai and Beijing to lower mortgage rates. I'd love to hear your take on what we're seeing in terms of the slowdown and where you think it's going to go.
I think the simplest answer is, particularly for asking from the perspective of what has actually changed over the last year or two, it's that the property sector is finally deflating, in large part, initially at least, because Beijing tried to make that happen because they thought it was too speculative. So as Jennifer mentioned, there have been slowdowns before. The dramatic one was 2015 when they had a lot of capital outflows, but that wasn't really seen as like a permanent structural thing. I think the difference this time is the narrative is that, oh, this might be lasting. The demographic situation has clearly gotten worse, but I should point out, I think actually what the real delta here is not necessarily the pace of reforms or demographics. It's really the property sector, and then the end of the export boom they got from COVID. Where is it going? I think the view in Bloomberg Economics is that essentially what used to be the low end case is now the baseline. So we could see something like 2 or 3% growth by the end of this decade. It had been put at 4% before that. For me, the big question is basically what's going to happen to the property sector. It's not obvious to me what can replace real estate in terms of an investment and an actual consumption driver, because it was basically a third of investment, and investment is a very large share of the economy. And the other alternatives would have to be infrastructure, which means more government debt for localities, which is in some cases already tapped out. And you could have more manufacturing investment, but a lot of that is based on internal demand or exports, which are slowing. So I think it's the narrative is maybe a little bit overhyped in the sense that people that were watching this closely would have said it's not dramatically different now than it was, say, 6 months or 9 or a year ago. I think just the narrative twist happened because a lot of people, including in markets, have been expecting the consumption rebound after they reopened from COVID to be more robust than it was. And it has happened, but it hasn't been enough to get back on their previous trajectory. So that intersecting with the exports and intersecting with the property sector is why it looks like it does. The recent indicators are, basically that maybe they're bottoming out in terms of manufacturing. There was data that came in overnight on smaller manufacturers that actually showed an expansion. On the other hand, the service sector data looked worse than expected. So it's not a collapse, but it's affecting the long-term trajectory, which I think is really why the perceptions have shifted.
Just before we go any further, I want to mention to our audience that you can send a direct message to our @business account if you have any questions, and we'll address them here on the air. Gerard, I mean, the other question for me is whether Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese leadership have a handle on this, right? And one of the things we heard as we were talking to folks here in Washington and in other capitals was this assumption that the Chinese leadership has been able to respond in the past, kind of confidence that they will be able to avoid a hard landing in the Chinese economy, and also, pointing out that China has a lot of financial resources that it can deploy to stimulate the economy if it needs to. Are you as confident that the Chinese leadership has a handle on this as some of the folks in officialdom?
I think the general narrative that the Chinese government is very good at economic planning is overhyped. That's less controversial to say now than it was 5 years ago. They're clearly monitoring the situation, given a bunch of measures released, particularly with mortgages and property sector over the past few days. I think they probably started to crack down the 3 red lines policy, as it was called, on the property sector without a clear plan as to where that was going and how to mitigate some of the effects. I think, frankly, they're probably mostly flying by the seat of their pants at this point. Can they manage it? Yes, probably, but probably in a way that is not optimal. And I think I have not really seen in the discourse of a plan for where the economy goes after real estate, and that to me remains the main question. So I would. Another point is that the Chinese fiscal policy has been quite conservative this year. Actually, if you look at just on budget spending, it's contracted year over year. Part of that is because they're trying to constrain debt levels in localities. But also, if you compare the discourse in China in recent years compared to the United States, where we both faced the same shock, which was COVID, U.S. fiscal policy was much more creative and much more expansive. The Chinese policymakers seem to keep reaching for the same tools, things like tax cuts, more infrastructure, rebates to try to get people to do consumption. What they have not done is provide direct support to households. So it's really not all that innovative. And I think there's a sense that they're kind of the old toolbox is getting stale, to muddle analogies.
Alessandra, I want to bring you in here and get the view from Rome and Europe. I guess the end of summer view from Europe. What are people making of this in European capitals? I mean, the sense in Washington for a long time has been that Europe is more reluctant, or has been more reluctant, to disengage with China, and sees China as less of a threat and perhaps more of a commercial partner than here in the U.S. But that seems to be changing.
There is this idea in Europe in general that they would wanted to follow the U.S.'s lead on China, but not quite as strong on certain issues. They were concerned about the relationship with China. Of course, when you talk about Europe, we're talking about lots of different countries. Each one has its own policy. There is also a EU Brussels view. We spoke to people in Berlin, in Rome, in Paris, and in Brussels. And the view seems to be that, particularly because China is slowing and it seems to be structural. I mean, one of our sources was saying, well, maybe it's a little bit like Europe after the big boom, after the big economic boom. You can't get that same kind of growth. And so it's something that going forward, they're not going to go quite the same way. But the capitals are concerned that, China shouldn't be left alone, shouldn't feel too threatened. So they're backing away slowly, one could say, from certain investments. But overall, they don't want China to feel ill at ease. And also consider, the EU's trade deficit with China is over $1 billion a day, so that's not going anywhere. What is happening is a lot of companies are sort of disinvesting. They're looking to India, they're looking to Southeast Asia. So the relative weight, of China is likely to decrease. But definitely this idea that Europe wants to help China, there are opportunities there for some companies, but they'll follow the American lead to a point.
And this gets that, and I was listening to the German ambassador, or the new German ambassador to Washington earlier this week, talk about this. But it gets to a little bit also what you were talking about, Jennifer, earlier on, which is, a slower China is just a less attractive China for investors, right? For foreign investors. And we had this, pretty also this week, pretty stunning statement from Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, as she was racing on a high-speed train from Beijing to Shanghai, talk about how she increasingly was hearing from U.S. companies that they saw China as uninvestable. And that's been, this relates to this inevitable rise narrative that had been there for so long. For so long, if you were a big multinational company, the future was China, right? And that is changing. Jennifer, Gerard, do you want to jump in?
Well, I worry that we're kind of overstating the transition here. So even if the Chinese economy is slowing down for structural reasons, which it probably is, China is still the world's leading manufacturer by far, right? So, and they're still advancing in various technologies. I wrote a piece on the terminal about how The slowdown will affect industrial policy in China, which is a major policy focus, obviously. And the bottom line is that it will probably maybe modestly constrain some of the expenditures, at least for localities. But the bigger effect is that it will make China a less appealing market, as you mentioned, and might make it basically reduce market entry, make it less competitive. That ends up reducing some of the effectiveness of industrial policy, because we know that in China's case, like with electric vehicles, like with solar panels, it works best when you have a lot of competition. And I think a slower growing economy where companies expect slower growth is one where those policies become less effective. But it's still going to be an economic powerhouse under any scenario.
Victoria, I want to bring you in here because you've been engaged in a conversation with folks at the U.S. Treasury for months now about China and growth. And I think of an interview you did in June with Janet Yellen, where she was starting to point to longer-term challenges in China, and possibly even saying that she was detecting a kind of changed attitude in conversations with the Chinese.
Yeah, hi, Sean. Thank you for having me. I mean, yeah, you're right. We talked about this in June. I think that was shortly after there was the Zambia deal on debt, which we were waiting for a long time, and we're just having this conversation. And I was like, is there a sense that China is becoming more constructive in certain international issues, and what could be driving that? And I think the Secretary mentioned at the time that it could be that they have these like long-term economic problems that we've discussed on this Twitter space, that there are the structural issues in their economy, the demographics, the youth unemployment. So it could be that they just want to put out a message to foreign investors that they are cooperative, they are constructive, and they are open for business, and they can sit at the table and talk. So I think that was like one of the first times we started thinking about it, at least internally, as an issue.
And I mean, the kind of mood in the relationship, right? That's been such a theme this year. I mean, it feels like a long time ago, but the Chinese spy balloons flying over America, and the reaction that we had then, the kind of the real attempts that we've seen from the Biden administration to re-engage in recent months. Gina Raimondo's trip this week was seen as pretty important. Jennifer, do you want to just talk a little bit about Raimondo's trip and also about the Chinese reaction?
Sure thing. So I think as folks are tracking, Raimondo was the fourth senior U.S. official to go to China in recent months, following Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and Climate Envoy John Kerry. Raimondo's trip, I think she was going with sort of a similar mission, a similar tone of, seeking to persuade China that we're not trying to contain China, that the export control measures that her department in particular manages are aimed at sort of a narrow band of technologies that the U.S. sees as having national security implications, not aimed at kind of constraining China's broader economic growth. And I think what was interesting from her trip in comparison to the prior officials was the kind of tone surrounding it, the atmosphere around it seemed far more positive, again, despite the fact that, she arguably represents the department that's dealt the most damage to China's economy in terms of those export controls. And yet the tone of her meeting seemed very positive. Even her comments about China's investment environment did not seem to spark as strong of a reaction. And we started to see kind of a mirroring of tones in Beijing in terms of what their expectations are now for these meetings. In advance of Raimondo's departure, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, was trying to kind of downplay expectations for the trip and saying, this isn't about producing major deliverables. This is about just keeping communication channels open. And I recall seeing a couple of commentaries in Beijing while Raimondo was there, echoing that same thing, that, this isn't about major deliverables. This is about keeping the channels of communication open. And even the outcomes from her trip, for example, the export control information exchange mechanism, it's clear from how Raimondo was describing it, that's not about changing U.S. policy. She seemed to be quite emphatic that the U.S. is not considering changing its policy on export controls. It's more about sharing more information with Beijing so that they understand the scope of them. So I think from my perspective, this is an indication that U.S. policy towards China, this competitive stance, is maturing. It's not really shifting. This is kind of an outgrowth of what the Biden administration has been trying to do for some time, which is, maintain stability in the relationship while continuing competitive actions. And Beijing, for the first few years, was very reluctant to even accept a sort of competitive frame for the relationship. And fought against that for some time. And what I saw this week with Raimondo being in Beijing seemed to be a little bit more perhaps begrudging acceptance of, this is the reality now of U.S. policy. It's not going to shift.
And do you think that kind of grudging acceptance is related at all to the fact that you have a weaker economy, that China's economy or China's position just may not be as strong?
Yeah, I think it's probably not entirely coincidental. And, even creating some sort of positive vibes from having your commerce secretary who, yes, her department controls the export controls, but they obviously control the commercial relationship as well. That, can't hurt to try and create some sort of positive atmosphere or sense that things might be moving in the right direction. And some of the other deliverables from her trip, another iteration of the tourism summit, starting of this sort of commercial working group, I think are aimed at doing that, creating some sense that there might be areas for improvement, even if marginal, in terms of the commercial relationship.
It's for years now, and this goes back to the Trump administration. One of the things I kept hearing from former officials was a kind of a real feeling that this dialogue, just a conversation between the U.S. and China, had really dried up, and that you had even lower level conversations that just weren't happening the same way that they used to in the past. But we seem to be kind of returning to normal a little bit. And, in the normal world, and I want to come back to you here, Victoria, we would have a kind of fall full of summitry. We've got the G20, although we learned yesterday that Xi Jinping is probably not attending that. We've got APEC coming up. We've got the ASEAN summit. Traditionally, this is where leaders have their bilaterals on the side, and the kind of relationship grows. What are we going to see in the coming weeks, Victoria?
Yeah, Sean, you're exactly right. I think over the past years, conversation at pretty much all levels has kind of stopped, and especially at places like the Treasury, it used to be in the past that they had very frequent talks with their counterparts, and that was a big issue because obviously, there was a lack of information about what was going on in the Chinese economy. But since the trips by Blinken, by Yellen, by Raimondo, more recently, I think there is a big concerted effort to reinstate channels of communication, leading up potentially to a meeting between Biden and Xi. And like you said, we don't expect Xi to go to India next week, or at least that's the latest we're hearing. But the APEC summit in San Francisco in November is kind of the next opportunity that people are looking at to see whether we will have a meeting at the leaders level and kind of have a more formal effort to thaw the relationship.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty remarkable if Xi Jinping comes to San Francisco on the eve of a U.S. election year. It's going to be some interesting geoeconomic theater around that. Alessandra, I just want to come back to you quickly as well here and say, what's the kind of European travel agenda for the coming months? I know, Europe, like the U.S., doesn't want to give up on the commercial relationship, even if China is slowing down. And we've certainly seen some EU member states and some British ministers head over to China with the usual sales pitch as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I don't think they can give up on the relationship. There's no option there, as you were kind of saying. There are going to be other opportunities, and I think there are several issues in Europe because, for example, I'm in Rome right now, and Italy is a partner in the Belt and Road. It's the only G7 nation which is in that. And they've sort of been encouraged by the US to get out of that, back away, but they're doing it slowly. And so that's sort of the tone. In many ways, they're actually not backing away from Belt and Road, but they're emptying it out. For example, there are now more increasingly in Europe, we see, export control measures of different kinds. Italy just passed one. And so that's kind of the softer attitude they're taking. It's very important, I think, to the Europeans to make sure that China doesn't feel like it's losing face. And I think that's what they're doing right now. On the other hand, one of the ministers told us off record, we can't expect China to change too much. If there's something we don't like, we're the ones who have to change and adapt. So I think that's something we've also been hearing on the European end.
All right, I think we're going to gently wrap this up. Before we do that, I want to do a kind of a final lightning round and put my colleagues on the spot here. I think, Gerard, we're going to start with you, and then we'll go back to Victoria, Alessandra, and end with Jennifer. I'm going to ask you a simple question, ask you for a punchy answer, and that is, when we gather back here a year from now, on the eve of the Labor Day weekend and the traditional end of summer here in the United States, which economy is going to be in better shape, the Chinese economy or the U.S. economy? And maybe we should bring in the European economy as well. And yes, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but that's why I'm here.
I think cyclically it might look like the Chinese economy has recovered, whereas the U.S. economy possibly could be in a brief recession. I think in the longer term, one thing just to emphasize with China is how government policy interacts with this problem, how they try to address it, whether it changes sentiment, particularly sort of in the technology and investment community, because a lot of this is basically within the hands of Beijing of how can they actually mitigate these issues and address the concerns that a lot of investors, including Chinese investors, have.
Victoria, I'm going to go to you. I'm sure they're incredibly confident at the U.S. Treasury that everything's going to be fine in the U.S. economy, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the sense for now is that, Beijing does have the tools to deal with like a large part of the issue the crisis it's facing, the slowdown it's facing, I guess. So I think whether they do that and the extent to which they do that and how they do that will determine the answer to your question. So I don't know that part, but I think at least for now, the sense is that, while this is obviously like a headwind for the global economy and it is a risk factor, it doesn't dent the optimism or the outlook for the U.S. economy, at least of the administration. So I think we have to wait and see what happens in Beijing.
Alessandra, over in Europe, one of the interesting things that we heard in reporting this piece was some governments kind of quietly welcoming the Chinese slowdown and saying that it would help their fight against inflation, which has been pretty stubborn there.
It has indeed. So I guess my answer is, we have to see what the European Central Bank does in the next couple of months, and whether that how that impacts the economy. The view from here, if I have to pick one of the three, it's still that the U.S. will ultimately, not do that badly. And China, in some ways, there was some Schadenfreude, as the Germans say, happiness that they're having some issues.
You said earlier it's not all about the economy, but boy, the economy is the kind of core of the relationship and has been for a long time, right?
No, I think that's right. It was often considered sort of the ballast of the relationship, particularly when China, was no longer kind of the Cold War ally that it had been. So I think going forward, it'll be interesting to see, again, coming off of Raimundo's trip, whether or not there is that sort of ballast, whether or not the business communities are really vouching for, kind of stabler ties in going forward. But as Gerard noted, China is going to continue to be a major market, a major economy. So to a certain extent, we shouldn't overhype the implications of that there. And in terms of where we'll be a year from now, I totally agree with everything he said in terms of like what the fundamentals will be going forward.